Hello, this is QWZNews at 10. We will have a special guest from Boston and from Charleston to discuss the controversial compromise of 1850. Let's go live to our correspondents in Boston and Charleston.
Hello, Dan. First, I would like to make it clear that I strongly disagree with the Compromise of 1850. I especially dislike the fugitive slave law, as it forces citizens here in the great free city of Boston to passively participate in the devilish activity of slavery. In Boston, the movement towards abolition is strong, and it can lead to violence. But I'd like to focus on the specific case of Anthony Burns, a runaway slave who had been free for a while. A riot ensued when he was brought in public, killing one guard, and the National Guard had to come and escort him away. This just shows the hatred towards the punitive law.
Oh, hello, Dan. As well, in the case of Mr. Burns, he is a fugitive slave and is property to someone in the South. He should be returned to his natural position in the establishment of slavery. I would also like to point out that this compromise lets the great establishment of slavery to expand. This treaty allows the Southern Principles ideas to thrive in the newly acquired areas of Utah and New Mexico territories, and giving them popular sovereignty. Although California is now a free state, the government has temporarily allowed the extension of slavery.
The expansion of the evil of slavery will ruin our country's promising and bright future, and will further split the country's political parties and violates the original Missouri Compromise.
This compromise is fair for all, mind you, and you speak ludicrous, sir. Your northern views are skewed and wrong, very wrong. Slavery fuels the southern economy, and without slavery, expansion, this great practice will die.
How enthralling. And now, on to Cornelius Brown with an insight on the recent Dred Scott case.
Thank you, Dan. The Supreme Court has recently come to a consensus on the controversial Dred Scott versus Stanford case. In a statement released yesterday, the court announced that it had ruled in favor of Stanford on the grounds that as a person of color, the Constitution recognizes the Scots as a member of an inferior race and subsequently cannot be regarded as a citizen of the United States. Dred and Harriet Scott are slaves belonging to a Mississippi doctor who, upon bringing them from Missouri to Wisconsin in 1846, the Scots sued for their freedom. The court's ruling ensures that Dred and Harriet Scott will remain as slaves for the rest of their life. Thank you.
We're having two guests on the show today, Antoinette Williams from New York and Charles McPherson from Alabama. They are here to express how different parts of the country are viewing Harriet Beecher Stowe's new book, Uncle Tom's Cabin.
Now, as we know, Uncle Tom's Cabin, the anti-slavery American novel by American author Harriet Beecher Stowe, is about a situation involving a black slave Tom who stood up to his master Legree, in such ways as refusing to beat a sick and feeble girl when asked. Do you think that what Uncle Tom did was acceptable?
Of course it wasn't acceptable. If the slave had just listened and obeyed to his master, then these situations just wouldn't occur.
Wasn't acceptable? Of course it was acceptable. Uncle Tom was only standing up for what he believed in. This is a perfect example of why the abolition of slavery is a good idea. Uncle Tom was being punished for not complying with a request that wasn't moral.
Uncle Tom is a slave, and in accordance with the Dred Scott v. Stanford decision, all Negroes born into slavery remain the property of the slaveholder. And now, guaranteed by the U.S. Constitution, we as slaveholders have a right to our property. And so if Legree wants to treat his property in a certain way, well, it's his American right to do so.
The Dred Scott decision was made by a bunch of slave-owning Southerners who held the majority in the Supreme Court. You can hardly call that democracy. As Robert Pruvis said, resolved that to attempt, as some do, to prove that there is no support given to slavery in the Constitution, an essential structure of the American government is to argue against reason and common sense, to ignore history, and to shut our eyes against palpable facts.
Let's move on to the next question. Do you think the book was written intentionally to cast Southerners in a bad light?
Yes, we are legally owning slaves in the South, and as long as they don't get too rowdy or out of line, they aren't hurt that much. But because of this book, the North wants to destroy the South's way of life, even though most slave owners don't even treat their slaves that badly.
Slavery is intolerable. It is the institution of putting other humans who have as much rights to become citizens as anyone else, who work hard to perpetuate the American system, into bondage. This book brings to light the horrors of Southern institution, and it's only the story of one man. Think of all the other horrors that are happening right now on hundreds of plantations across the South.
Thank you, Charles McPherson and Antoinette Williams, for your time. Back to you, Dan.
And now, let's turn to our on-site reporter, Reginald Cumberbatch, who is in Charlestown, Virginia, just outside the courthouse where John Brown is being put on trial. Reginald?
Thanks, Fluffy. Like you said, we're in Charlestown, which is just a few miles outside of Harper's Ferry, where the raid took place just 2 weeks ago. The trial has been taking some time. It's been a strange time in court, because John Brown has admitted to all the charges that have been brought up against him, including treason, 13 accounts of murder, and inciting insurrection. If he is found guilty within the next few days, he will be executed. When he arrived in Harper's Ferry, the town was in no way ready for the insurrection, so it wasn't too difficult for his party to gain control of the armory. Across the Potomac as well was a separate rifle factory, which 2 of his men took control of. Soon, Brown began gaining captives, Colonel Washington and a few others, and that is really what made the officials and the Marines hesitant to begin a raid on the armory.
I heard that Colonel Washington is speaking at the trial, but did any of the other hostages get killed? And what occurred during the raid?
No hostages were killed by Brown's group, but the mayor of Harper's Ferry, Fontaine Beckham, and a few military men and unarmed citizens were killed while they began to fight back against Brown. However, all of Brown's men, including his sons, were killed in a quick and decisive raid led by Colonel Robert E. Lee and Lieutenant Israel Green, the latter of who injured Brown with his dress sword, allowing for the capture of the so-called bearded insurrectionist.
Well, that's very good news for the people to hear.
Colonel Washington has spoken at the trial, saying, and I quote, "Brown commanded his men with the utmost composure, encouraging them to be firm and to sell their lives as dearly as they could. All of the other hostages, or anyone who has seen Brown during the raid, can testify to this, that Brown remained cool and collected despite the 3 sons that lay dead at his feet, and surely the other 2 dead outside of the armory. Brown retains his own innocence, but not that he did not commit treason or murder or inciting insurrection among the slaves of Virginia. However, he believes that what he did is right."
What has he said about this matter?
To quote Brown, "I believe to have interfered as I have done, as I have always freely admitted I have done. In behalf of this despised poor, I have done no wrong, but right." That came from his address to the court, which he gave not long ago. He goes on in his speech to say that he never made people join his provisional army, but they always joined of their own accord. He then says that his actions were ordained by God, quoting the New Testament by saying that, "Remember them that are in bonds as bound with them." His eloquent speech has already started to spread some of his ideas among the people of Charlestown, but if it has had any effect on the jury, we do not yet know.
Thank you, Reginald. We'll come back to you when you have further news. John Brown's raid just goes to show that the tension between the North and South is increasing to the point of violence. And even though Brown was an extremist, that does not mean that others do not share his views. Now we're back to Reginald Cumberbatch, who has stunning news on the John Brown case. Reginald?
Thank you, Fluffy. Yes, in a not-so-surprising turn of events, the man hangs, and the jury does not. John Brown has been found guilty of all charges and is to be hung from the gallows in Charlestown on December the 2nd. He has said that the crimes of this guilty land will not be purged away, but with blood. It is truly stunning to hear the calmness in his voice as he says this. What this may mean for the country, what sympathizers may arise in the North, and what fear and panic may spread in the South, we will see. But his raid has ultimately failed, as we have seen from this trial. Back to you, Fluffy.
Thank you, Reginald. And maybe Brown was prepared for this failure. And maybe he knows what terror even an abortive raid may cause. In the end, even if he has gone, his ideas will stay.
We will be right back after this commercial break. Now you just take this here gallon flogger. You've seen enough of it to know how.
I'm willing to work night and day, and work while there's life and breath in me. But this year thing I can't feel it right to do. And master, I never shall do it. Never!
What? You blasted black beast? What do you think you are?
The poor critter's sick and feeble. 'Twould be downright cruel. It's what I never will do.
Just in, we've received continued news on the ongoing guerrilla warfare raging between the pro and anti-slavery supporters in the Kansas Territory. We're going down to our on-the-scene correspondent in Kansas.
Apparently, these here hostiles were triggered when the abolitionist John Brown murdered 5 pro-slavery supporters in response to a raid on the Free State capital at Lawrence, carried out by pro-slavery supporters as well. I'm told that the Republicans have came up with 2 slogans to represent what was going on. Bleeding Kansas, to account for the casualties among the violence here in Kansas, coinciding with Bleeding Sumner for the Senator Charles Sumner, who was brutally caned by the Southerner Preston Brooks.
Thank you for the update. The Kansas-Nebraska Act has negated the Missouri Compromise, which previously kept the peace between the peoples of Kansas and Nebraska. They are now being ravaged by the many civil wars going on there at this time. Now to our next breaking story. Mrs. Ferguson of Kentucky has her cat, Samantha, stuck in a tree. Will she ever get out? We'll see.
About his capture. He had a whole bunch of... What? What am I saying?
But if it has any effect to the jury, we do not net you owe.
Pro-slave supporters in response to raid... Nah, I can't talk.
Thank you for the update.
Conclusion. We need a conclusion of some sorts.
It could have been a lot worse.
Okay, we need...